It began with a little game for children to amuse and frighten each other. A séance in a dark, empty house. Don't tell the grown-ups. But something unexpected happened that night. Some awful evil awoke in the foul dampness. Something each child sensed and fled from. All but one. Poor little Rose, shrieking her terror in that attic room as some quivering form approached. Poor little Rose, unspeakably invaded. Now, 20 years later, she has discovered unearthly powers she never had before, witnessed horrors no one else can see. The gruesome presence that claimed her in childhood is ready now for the ultimate evil consummation, and Rose will learn at last the monstrous truth about the Parasite. Ramsey Campbell is an interesting name in the annals of horror fiction. A close contemporary to some of the biggest names in the genre, including Stephen King, James Herbert, Anne Rice, and Dean Koontz to name a few, Campbell's work has, by comparison at least, maintained a strictly cult appeal. Often described as a horror writer's horror writer, Campbell has certainly been acclaimed by his peers. King said of the book in question, "One of the scariest novels of horror and the occult that I've read in a long time," while Peter Straub, author of Ghost Story, called it the book Ramsey Campbell readers have been waiting for. It affects the reader for days afterward. Campbell has also been cited as a significant influence on many younger authors, specifically Neil Gaiman, Clive Barker, and Kim Newman. However, this generous acclaim among his fellow writers has never translated into the same broader, mainstream success enjoyed by many of those same contemporaries. Compared to even his most controversial of colleagues, Campbell tends to be an author who greatly divides the opinions of his readers. Looking at user reviews and ratings for The Parasite, it isn't unusual to see a large number of negative 1- and 2-star reviews among the already small number of readers. Despite the obvious depth of the writing, Campbell's work seems to infuriate as much as it enthralls. Having now read 2 of Campbell's books, The Nameless from 1981 and the book in question, I can certainly appreciate and understand why his work elicits such a divisive response. Looking at Campbell's work in relation to other pulp horror authors of the same generation, there's a definite unwillingness on Campbell's part to satisfy or satiate the more extreme or salacious tastes of the horror audience. Gore is minimal in these books. Instead, the events are restrained, somber and slow-moving. Compared to a writer like James Herbert, Campbell doesn't front-load his books with scenes of violent carnage, which drag the reader kicking and screaming into a world gone mad. Nor do his stories follow a particular formula, for instance, having expositional sequences punctuated by more terrifying set pieces. They're not gratuitous or tasteless for the sake of it, something that writers like Shaun Hutson and Richard Laymon are often accused of. Nor are they gleefully perverse or transgressive, like the works of Clive Barker. Instead, Campbell tends to follow a specific character, detailing the minutiae of their everyday lives, their work, their relationships, their connection to a specific place. And then, very slowly, as the story progresses, he introduces elements of the uncanny, weaving strange mysteries and conspiracies into the already unfolding plot. This in turn makes us question the authenticity of the characters' perceptions, making us doubt their own sense of reality, and in turn challenging our own perceptions as well. When moments of horror do occur, they tend to play out as impressions of unreality, intruding upon the ordinary, the mundane. Such sequences work on a level of suggestion and insinuation, undermining the lived reality and experiences of the central characters, and forcing them to question their own sanity. This is a concept central to the book in question, in which Campbell introduces us to a protagonist who has suppressed a violent incident from their childhood. And when they begin to process and relive the circumstances of this event in later life, are forced to reckon with the repressed trauma of that same terrifying ordeal. There is a term that's popular in discussions around contemporary horror cinema: elevated horror. As a lifelong fan of horror fiction, it's a term I genuinely despise. It underpins a certain snobbery around attitudes to horror, and reduces much of the genre's greatest, most popular successes to the status of low culture. It suggests a hierarchy of horror, which I think is insulting and false. Perhaps more so than any other genre, horror is a broad church. The gore and sensationalism of a film like Terrifier can sit comfortably alongside the aestheticised psychological horrors of films like The Babadook and St. Maud. Just as the lurid exploitation of films like Last House on the Left and Driller Killer could sit comfortably alongside bigger budgeted studio films like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. But while snobbery certainly exists, reverse snobbery exists too, and a book like The Parasite likely suffers due to the expectations of its readers, with Campbell denying us the cheap thrills and gross-out spectacle that this era of pulp horror fiction is expected to deliver. If we continue with the cinematic analogy, and why not, The Parasite is a book full of allusions to films and discussions on the history of cinema, then writers like Stephen King, James Herbert, and Peter Straub are perhaps the literary equivalent of filmmakers like John Carpenter, Wes Craven, and George A. Romero. Horror auteurs who broke into the mainstream and had a massive impact on the formation and the popularity of the genre during the 1970s and 1980s. Each of their works built on the legacy of the great horror masters who came before, and each of them went on to redefine the popular tropes and iconography of the genre for future generations. By comparison, a book like The Parasite is arguably closer to something like the art house horror of a film like Possession by Andrzej Żuławski, another story about a woman in crisis. Like Possession, The Parasite uses horror as a vehicle to explore an intensely personal story. A psychodrama, heavy with themes of PTSD, loss of identity, assimilation, estrangement, and indeed psychological possession. Both works find horror occurring in the background of a story that is as much about the breakdown in trust and communication between a husband and wife, familial dysfunction, as it is about ghosts and ghouls. Both works have a profound sense of setting and place, the locations becoming central characters. The tone of each work is cold, clinical, but punctuated by moments of creeping dread, uncertainty, and a kind of unknowing paranoia, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere where the anticipation of horror is more palpable than the horror itself. Possession is no more elevated as a work of cinema than a more popular horror film such as Friday the 13th or Halloween, both films thematically rich and intelligent in their ideas and execution. But nonetheless, it is a film that caters to a different level of expectation, one where style and tone are as important as the more conventional emphasis on character and plot. Many of Campbell's critics have accused the author of indulging in style over substance, his descriptive prose decorative and exhausting, as it drags out scenes and set pieces into a veritable stream of consciousness, an orgy of words. But for readers like myself, fascinated and immersed in Campbell's reverie of text, it's more a case that style is substance. When one talks about elevated horror, what they really mean is that the work is using the language of horror, but that it isn't as much concerned with satisfying our expectations of the genre. Instead, it's using horror as a stepping-off point into something more unknowable or extreme, using horror as a context with which to experiment with imagery, language, tone, stylization, and in taking a story that is on the surface identifiable, human, even mundane, and pushing it into new and alarming directions by the introduction of supernatural elements. Horror for Campbell isn't the face at the window, or the veiled figure standing at the foot of the bed. It's not the masked killer stalking a vulnerable woman through the savage streets. It's the slow prickling of something inexplicable on the back of the neck. It's the whisper in the dark. It's the sense of a found object being subtly out of place. It's the familiar spaces transformed by a sudden dearth of people into something all at once sinister and unsafe. Campbell's writing is wordy. His books are a slow burn, painting streets upon streets in the most exhausting detail, or describing the journey of light, or the passage of a cloud across the surface of a river, in reveries of similes and metaphors. Much of the style is about building momentum, however. Each manifestation of the supernatural, each psychic threat, each break from reality, chips away a little more of the character's resolve. It further alienates her from a support network of friends and family, leaves her vulnerable to destructive forces both within and without. However grueling the reader might find the exhaustive descriptions of places, the endless travelogue of countries and cities, the chattering discussions about Hitler's psychic research, astral projection, or the aesthetics and politics of German expressionist cinema, none of it ever feels gratuitous or unearned. By the time we reach the final act of the book, these digressions and diversions have succeeded in broadening and deepening the themes of the book, and with it, both our connection to the central character and the threat of the shadowy forces that stand against her. It all pays off beautifully, with an incredible climactic series of confrontations, which build and build into a vivid phantasmagoria, becoming an example of some of the strongest horror writing I've ever experienced. By the end of the book, the themes that Campbell has woven into the background of the story are fully realised. What seemed on the surface a story of the occult, or a horror story about strange supernatural forces, is really about so much more than that. It's a story about trauma, about female agency and autonomy, and about the loss of self that is so often symptomatic of a nervous breakdown. In this context, the book could very easily be read as a metaphor on the scars of childhood abuse. Certainly this is palpable in the way the character of Rose reacts to any subsequent threat of violence, withdrawing into herself. The occurrences of the supernatural could even be taken as manifestations of the psychological. There is also the notion of the initial attack as being suppressed, the immediate change in behaviour explicit in Rose's personality following her acceptance of this abuse, and the fact that the reality of the attack becomes something too painful for the character's family to properly talk about or even acknowledge. Ramsey Campbell might not be as successful as Stephen King, or as widely regarded as Clive Barker, but he strikes me as a great writer and an interesting voice in the horror genre. After reading The Nameless, I began picking up as many of Campbell's books as I could find. Currently, I have several of his books in my collection, including The Doll Who Ate His Mother, The Face That Must Die, Incarnate, The Influence, Ancient Images, and his short story collection, Demons by Daylight, all of which I'm very much looking forward to reading soon. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to hear me talk about other books by Ramsey Campbell, then do let me know in the comments. Likewise, if you're a fan of the author, or if you have any recommendations for other Ramsey Campbell books that are worth looking into, then please let me know. Thanks for watching.